who is going to talk to us about innovative methods for teaching and engagement in research methods. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Angelica. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the research I've done as part of my MA in Teaching and Learning, looking at innovative methods for increasing student engagement in research methods courses. So for most of you, it won't be shocking news that research methods courses are not the most popular. Students find them hard, don't find them interesting, and don't necessarily see the relevance to their degree and to their career. So research methods courses grew out of or to complement traditional statistics courses. As well as teaching statistics, alongside that, they also teach other practical parts of the research process, including things like data collection, critical appraisal, literature searching, and research ethics. Now, statistics courses themselves don't have a great reputation for being easy or interesting. But over the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of work improving statistics education, but a lot less of that seems to have carried through to research methods courses. And it's only more recently that there's been a little bit of work done on pedagogy specifically related to research methods courses. So my key motivation behind this research is that I was helping to develop a new research methods course within the Faculty of Education and Health Sciences, and I see some members of the team have joined us on the call for this. And so I was going to be the first person to be running this new research methods course in the School of Allied Health this year in 2021. And so I guess when I was thinking about what I was going to do for my master's research, I was really thinking about what can I do to try and advance and improve the design of the course and try and make it as engaging as possible for the students. So rather than looking at the published literature or just doing some sort of like relatively dry quantitative survey, I thought if I looked at the published literature, I'd mostly be finding about what people were doing a few years ago. But what I really wanted to try and do was to get a rich insight into what exciting stuff was happening right now, the kind of stuff that might, say, turn up in the literature in 3 to 5 years' time. So my aim was basically to talk to people internationally who have a reputation for doing innovative things in their research methods courses to try and find out what I could do to try and increase student engagement. So I went out and completed semi-structured interviews with 13 participants from a range of job roles from different countries and different disciplinary backgrounds. The interviews were automatically transcribed by Teams, and I re-listened to the interviews and worked with the transcripts to inductively code them. Time permitting, I hope to collect a bit more data over the summer from even a broader variety of disciplines and maybe some different countries even further afield before I go on to try and publish some of these results. So I think perhaps the most pervasive but probably unsurprising finding was the extent to which many of my participants had totally rethought and reimagined their curricula, often multiple times, and almost invariably with a real focus on building students' kind of conceptual understanding. So how did my innovative teachers go about building engagement with their students? So these could probably be broken down into 2 types. So there are a number of great suggestions for teaching specific topics. The full list will hopefully be available at this web address in a couple of weeks' time. It's not all up there as yet. And that site will also have my research materials and also quite a few of the interview transcripts as well. So there were some specific strategies for teaching specific topics and then also some more general strategies. So to give you an idea of the use of specific strategies, I'm going to use Erin Buchanan's use for policing metaphor to teach hypothesis testing. So essentially what happens here, and you'll be familiar with this process if you watch any crime dramas like ever, is that the police receive a report of somebody committing a crime. They then go and collect evidence relating to the crime, but the person that's been accused has the presumption of innocence. The evidence is then forwarded to a trial where it's put together by the prosecution, and the jurors go away and weigh the evidence. And if enough jurors say the person is guilty, then they're convicted. But often it's a bit like one of those true crime podcasts that some of you might have listened to. So we don't actually know whether the person is guilty. Sometimes there might not be enough evidence to convict a guilty person, and occasionally an innocent person might be found guilty. So how does this relate to research methods and hypothesis testing? So the report to the police is like developing a hypothesis. You then have to collect evidence or data to test the hypothesis. And in the same way that in the judicial system, the accused has the presumption of innocence, in hypothesis testing, there's this presumption that the null hypothesis is true, or essentially that your hypothesis that you want to test is false. The statistical test then acts as a trial. And in the same way that for a jury, there's a threshold to reach conviction. So in some jurisdictions, you need to convince all of the jurors. Sometimes it's just a majority, or sometimes maybe just one short of the number of jurors. And so in the same way that there's this threshold for deciding whether a person is guilty, to decide whether there is evidence for an effect, you need to get a p-value less than your alpha, which is usually set at 0.05. And so if you get the p-value less than that threshold, then you're able to reject that presumption of the null hypothesis and say that there is evidence of a true effect. But it's still like a true crime podcast. So we never really know whether there is a true effect, in the same way that we don't ever really know whether someone is guilty a lot of the time. All we have is the p-value to go on, in the same way that you only really know whether the person is convicted or they weren't convicted. So that means that sometimes we won't find evidence of an effect that really is there, and sometimes we'll find evidence for an effect that isn't actually there. And also a bit like in crime cases. In some cases, the evidence can be truly overwhelming, so it is really pretty clear. A little bit like if you have CCTV footage of the crime being committed. But in other cases, the evidence is much more circumstantial and there's a sort of a greater deal of uncertainty. So that was an example of a really nice, innovative and engaging way of teaching a specific part of research methods. I'm now going to talk about some more general strategies. Almost everyone I talked to was teaching students who didn't have particularly homogenous backgrounds. So this could be that some of their students might have taken some statistics at high school, or that they had students who had completed degrees in areas with like a heavy research methods emphasis. So they'd already had like a really strong research methods background. And this could then contrast to students who have like a very profoundly non-quantitative humanities type background, or things like engineering or architecture, which has some of the kind of like the quantitative and rigorous elements, but really works in like a very, very sort of different way to I guess the kind of the social science, health kind of like research methods, which I would be talking about here. And so because of this, there was a really clear belief among my participants that self-pacing was really important. That for some of the stronger students, where the material might effectively be serving as revision, they might want to skip through it at speed. Whereas if you have a student who comes in with very little background, they might need to invest more effort. And so they might want to take things much slower and work through things at a very different rate. So given what I've just said, it's maybe not a great shock to you that most of the people that I'd talked to had embraced a flipped classroom model, with blended learning replacing much of what would have been the traditional lecture content. And so this first quote here is quite sort of interesting, in that this person sort of started out, I think, in a relatively conventional model, but started to introduce some more kind of like interactive things in person, kind of like complementing their lecture. But then slowly over time, they really realized that they needed to like fully flip the classroom. So the stuff which was originally in their lecture was slowly going to move into a blended kind of online learning space. And there was going to be, when they were meeting in person or doing stuff live, that it needed to be much more kind of like interactive content. And I think this would be in some ways probably similar to my own journey in terms of teaching research methods over the years, that I would have started out trying to do some more kind of like dynamic examples in class, and maybe moving some of the content away from teaching in a lecture to the point where I now have a course which is really primarily flipped, so that all of what would have originally been lecture content is delivered online, and all of the live sessions, which hopefully will eventually go back to being in person, are all very much done in a way that you're doing things in the sessions. They're not just sort of like sitting more passively listening to them. And just in terms of making this work in an engaging way for the students, there was a really big emphasis through a variety of different methods, just to make sure that any asynchronous materials online the navigation through them was really clear, that it was obvious to students what the links were between what they were doing online, into class, and making sure that it was all sort of in a sensible order. And so as part of this discussion, there was a lot of talk about making asynchronous content. And no one who had adopted the flipped model was recording their lectures in the same way as previously. So they had a really clear move to break them up into shorter and also much more highly polished chunks. And often the sum of all of the things which they were sort of putting online would probably be less than half the time content of what it might have been in a live lecture format. So if you started out with a 2-hour lecture, you might only end up with like 40 or 50 minutes of content. There was also a sort of a shared perception from my participants that students had higher expectations of asynchronous videos because they were not being made fresh every year, people were willing to put in the extra effort to make them clear and polished and engaging. And so I think a further example of that advantage of that is that when you're trying to explain really difficult concepts, it's much better to have a short, really clear, masterfully explained version, which students could watch several times if necessary, rather than kind of like more ad-libbed explanations, which might occur in a live lecture. So I've sort of really talked about what they were doing with helping students who might have had weaker prior backgrounds. There were also some extension assignments and additional content to help engage stronger students, though not everybody was doing things necessarily targeting at stronger students. And one of the people I talked to ran a research happy hour in the student pub where they talked through more advanced things. Apparently running short on time, so I'll quickly zip through these last bits, hopefully. So the software simulations were another really common feature. The one depicted here is a pretty simple one, but some participants had much more complex simulations involving research design, data collection, right through to kind of the analysis phase. And also kind of getting the students involved in maybe designing data collection, collecting it on themselves, and then kind of like processing it through, and also having the lecturers talk about their own research experiences were also really valued as an engagement tool. Okay, so just to finish up, I haven't really touched on this at all, but it became clear to me that there's been a lot of great work in making statistics education more engaging, and this hasn't really permeated into the statistics part of research methods courses yet. There was a really clear consensus that the flipped and blended model was the way to go, with a focus on high quality content, but also taking advantage of shared open resources that were available. Having the students participate in the research project themselves and trying to link it into making it relevant to their future and to their degrees. And I guess, again, just emphasising based on that shared ethos that there are a lot of great ideas out there. There are a lot of people doing really cool stuff. And so the best thing to do is probably try and combine these to produce a tailored and really engaging course.
Thank you very much, James. Your timing was right on the spot, by the way.